Hi there, and welcome. Tonight, we travel back to medieval times, where royalty lived in castles and peasants lived in something vaguely house-shaped, if they were lucky. Life was simple in the sense that you either starved quietly in a muddy field or ruled over those who did. You were either a king, draped in velvet and rolled in gold, or a peasant who used a rock for a pillow. A king wakes up, and so does a peasant. Mourning in medieval times was a democratic experience in the sense that everyone had to endure it. Whether one awoke beneath a golden canopy or beside a turnip with opinions, the sun rose without discrimination. What happened next, however, was wildly unequal. In a castle the size of 3 villages, stacked on top of one another, the day began with ceremony. The rooster did not dare to crow until signalled. There were protocols, rituals, and a man whose entire job was to open curtains dramatically. He had practiced. The royal bed, technically classified as a small continent, contained enough pillows to smother an uprising. The mattress was stuffed with feathers from birds that had never even seen a commoner. Waking up was not an individual effort. It was a group activity involving attendants, musicians, and a man with a scroll to remind the king who he was. Across the fields, far from the drapery and incense, a peasant stirred, not by choice. There were no curtains, only the vague suggestion of walls and a roof that doubled as a sieve when it rained. The peasant awoke when the sun stabbed him directly in the eyes, or when the pig got hungry and sat on his chest. Either way, the alarm system was efficient. While the king remained horizontal for an additional 30 minutes of supervised waking, the peasant had already stepped into shoes that were technically more whole than fabric. He scratched parts of himself that had not been legally washed since the last harvest festival and made his way to whatever passed for a wash basin. Often this was a suspicious puddle. In the castle, washing was a sacred act. Water was drawn from a spring so pure it had diplomatic immunity. The king bathed in something referred to as scented nectar, which was technically just warm water with flower bits, but branding mattered. 3 servants attended the process. 1 poured, 1 scrubbed, and 1 offered polite applause. Back in the village, the peasants' version of bathing included splashing mud on cleaner mud and calling it exfoliation. Soap existed, but it was guarded by the village elder, who believed in using it only on holy days and visible limbs. The peasant's bath was quick, cold, and featured a cameo appearance by a frog. Clothing preparation also diverged slightly between social classes. The king's wardrobe required a team of trained professionals, a battle plan, and an understanding of 15 different types of lace. Getting dressed was less a task and more an orchestral performance, complete with sighs of admiration and spontaneous poetry. The peasant, meanwhile, had 2 outfits, work and slightly less work. The distinction was academic. Whichever one wasn't already on his body was probably frozen to a nail on the wall. Putting on clothes involved shaking out straw, patching a new hole with a slightly older patch, and hoping the smell of onions covered everything else. Breakfast followed. The king dined on a light meal consisting of half the known world's food supply. There were eggs poached in wine, bread baked with spices shipped in from places no one could point to on a map, and a cheese so aged it remembered the Crusades. The morning feast was accompanied by a lute solo and someone reciting flattering verses, because breakfast without ego stroking was simply barbaric. Meanwhile, the peasant located a root. Not a specific kind, just whatever hadn't been eaten by rodents or taxed into oblivion. If bread was involved, It was hard enough to legally qualify as a weapon. There was no music, unless one counted the persistent wheezing of a distant relative with seasonal lung rot. Once fed, the king prepared for the strenuous task of deciding what to be mildly annoyed by that day. There were important duties to consider, such as judging things, approving things, and frowning thoughtfully. He moved through hallways larger than entire villages, flanked by men whose job was to agree with him at different volumes. The peasant, now fully alert due to accidental tooth contact with breakfast, began the day's labour. This included hauling, digging, and arguing with livestock that had unionised in spirit, if not in writing. The goal of the work was to survive long enough to do it again tomorrow. Mid-morning in the castle involved sitting on a throne, on cushions, occasionally on the idea of governance. The king would listen to petitions, most of which involved someone begging not to be set on fire. He would nod, stroke his beard, or someone else's if his was unavailable, and make declarations that became law unless he forgot about them by lunch. At the same hour, the peasant was waist deep in a task that defied the laws of physics and basic human dignity. If it wasn't mucking out something, it was lifting something else that shouldn't legally be considered liftable. No one listened to his petitions unless they involved borrowing a spoon. Lunchtime brought new challenges. The king had to choose between pheasant or peacock, a difficult decision made easier by the knowledge that someone else would be blamed either way. There were sauces, garnishes, and a man employed solely to describe what he was eating in flattering adjectives. Digestion occurred while reclining and judging architecture. The peasant's lunch was a stew. Technically, it involved a pot, some water, and whatever had fallen into the pot accidentally. This was eaten with a wooden spoon that doubled as a shoehorn. Digestion occurred while working, walking or ducking from airborne turnips. After lunch, the king took part in royal leisure. This included hawking, chess, and confusing foreigners. He might commission a tapestry if he was feeling particularly ambitious, or declare a new law about window taxes. Recreation was taken seriously. Someone's head might roll if he didn't enjoy himself sufficiently. The peasant's recreation came in short, unintentional bursts, blinking slightly longer than necessary, sitting without groaning, or daydreaming about bread with corners. Hobbies included repairing things that refused to be repaired and counting fingers to make sure none had fallen off. As the sun dipped slightly in the sky, the king attended to affairs of state. These included nodding at maps, mispronouncing foreign names, and adding gold to the treasury by inventing fines for things like whistling on Wednesdays. He was advised by men with large sleeves and no idea what peasants actually were. The peasant also had affairs to manage, mostly involving manure, animal disputes, and the fine art of surviving a hailstorm with only one hat between 6 people. Economic policy for the peasant meant deciding whether to eat the chicken or let it lay another egg. These decisions were made with all the weight of a national budget. Evening brought supper, an event so excessive for the king it required its own room, staff, and musical overture. The meal involved at least 5 courses, one of which was usually something moulded into the shape of the king's face. Alcohol flowed freely, because nothing said authority like being drunk while making policy. The peasant's supper was whatever hadn't been eaten by dogs, rats, or the neighbour with flexible morals. Lighting was courtesy of a single candle, whose flame represented both hope and the annual lighting budget. Alcohol, if it appeared, was usually medicinal or moonshine, and often both. After dinner, the king was entertained. Minstrels sang, acrobats flipped, and someone with a trained ferret did something that was probably art. Applause was mandatory. If the king smiled, it was considered a good omen. If he laughed, someone might get promoted. If he yawned, someone might get executed. Morale depended heavily on royal amusement. Meanwhile, the peasants' post-dinner routine involved looking for lost tools, negotiating bedtime with the goat that slept indoors, and occasionally telling stories that started with, "Remember when it didn't rain frogs for 3 days straight?" As night fell, the king retired to his royal chambers. A team of servants removed one garment per person to give everyone something to do. He was read to, sung to, and reminded gently of how magnificent he was. He slept on a mattress so plush it had diplomatic ties with France. The peasant returned to his hovel, stepped over at least 3 types of livestock, and collapsed onto a bed made of straw, regret, and an old potato sack that once held dreams. He fell asleep to the sounds of snoring, leaking, and mild despair. And as both slept, the world kept turning, one side weighed down by gold, the other by mud. But the gap between them was just getting warmed up. Laws, taxes, and the science of oppression. In medieval times, the law was a majestic beast, ancient, mysterious, and frequently asleep at the wheel. It was a patchwork quilt of decrees, edicts, whims, and things someone's great-uncle swore the previous king once muttered after too much mulled wine. Clarity was not a priority. Consistency was considered suspicious. But one principle remained. The law was there to ensure that the rich stayed comfortable and the poor stayed available for lifting things. At the top of the legal pyramid stood the monarch, whose understanding of justice mostly involved deciding who looked guilty from a distance. The law was interpreted by men in robes whose primary qualification was being literate and knowing which side of the quill was the writing end. Court proceedings, when they occurred, resembled elaborate improv theatre with less logic and more beheading. Legal documents were written in Latin, a language specifically chosen to ensure no one understood what they were agreeing to. This was not a bug, it was a feature. If peasants had questions, they were invited to not have them. Disputes were often settled by trial by ordeal, which involved things like walking on hot irons or being thrown into a lake to see if you floated. Floating proved guilt, sinking proved innocence, and also the urgent need for a new defendant. Taxes, on the other hand, were crystal clear in one respect. You owed them. The exact amount and purpose, however, were open to interpretation, especially by the people demanding them. There were land taxes, hearth taxes, road tolls, and a particularly creative one called a tithe, which was 10% of everything you owned, wanted to own, or thought about owning in a dream. The tax collector arrived with the enthusiasm of a wedding guest and the empathy of a wet sock. Peasants paid taxes in crops, livestock, coins, if they had any, which they didn't, and sometimes by donating family members to the local militia. This was called service, and it was mandatory, which is the best kind of service according to people who don't have to provide it. Nobles paid taxes in theory, but in practice they simply explained that their titles made them allergic to fiscal responsibility. To enforce these laws and taxes, there were sheriffs. These men were not the charming, misunderstood rogues portrayed in tavern plays. They were humorless individuals whose main job was to collect things and glare at people. A sheriff was typically accompanied by a group of equally humorless assistants, often called men-at-arms, or, in peasant dialect, those bastards. The sheriff's toolkit included a list of demands, a sack for confiscated goods, and a keen sense for finding hidden potatoes. If a peasant failed to pay, the options included fines, imprisonment, or being volunteered for something heroic and fatal. If a noble failed to pay, the matter was settled over a polite dinner, followed by everyone agreeing to forget about it. Justice was administered in various ways. There were royal courts, manorial courts, ecclesiastical courts, and when all else failed, the court of whatever the baron feels like today. Trials were held in halls with poor acoustics and worse ventilation. A trial could last minutes or months, depending on how much wine the judge had consumed. Witnesses were considered optional, and evidence was defined loosely as anything that made the judge nod. Testimonies could be purchased, forged, or threatened into existence. Perjury was frowned upon, but only in a disappointed parent sort of way. Truth was less important than volume and confidence. Punishments varied by social status. A noble might be fined, exiled, or forced to attend a boring feast. A peasant, on the other hand, could look forward to stocks, flogging, or a deeply unpleasant encounter with a branding iron. Executions were public events, attended with the same enthusiasm as local fairs. Children were brought to watch, snacks were consumed, and everyone went home slightly traumatized but oddly entertained. Prisons existed, though calling them that was generous. They were stone rooms with optimistic air circulation and a decor style best described as wet dungeon. Food was theoretical, light was optional, and rats enjoyed diplomatic immunity. Most prisoners were either waiting for a trial or slowly becoming part of the wall. One particularly beloved legal practice was the heriot, a cheerful tradition where the lord took a peasant's best animal when the peasant died. It was framed as a way of thanking the lord for his benevolent rule. In reality, it was an early form of inheritance theft with ceremonial flair. Widows often found themselves mourning both the husband and the only cow with a name. Laws were updated regularly, which is to say whenever someone important was mildly inconvenienced. If a noble stepped in manure, a decree against poorly managed livestock followed. If a bishop sneezed during incense hour, regulations on peasant firewood were passed. This created a legal code that was sprawling, contradictory, and useful only to people who owned libraries. Literacy was not common among peasants, and legal notices were read aloud in the village square by someone with a booming voice and a loose relationship with pronunciation. These readings were attended by the curious, the bored, and people hoping to find out if they were accidentally criminals. New laws were often met with silence, followed by someone muttering, "We'll ignore that one like the last three." The church also had laws, canon laws, which were enforced by ecclesiastical courts. These laws governed everything from marriage to where you could be buried to whether or not your goat had blasphemed. Violations could result in excommunication, which was essentially being socially unfriended by God. This was a serious matter, especially since heaven had a very exclusive guest list. Monks were the spiritual bureaucrats of the era. They copied laws, interpreted scripture, and occasionally acted as judges when the local lord was off jousting or fainting from gout. Their handwriting was legendary, elegant, unreadable, and perfectly suited for confusing future historians. Monastic punishment for crimes included extra prayers, bread without the butter, and being glared at by someone named Brother Geoffrey. Naturally, there were rebels. These brave or foolish individuals occasionally stood up and questioned the entire system. Peasants might stage revolts, often with tools repurposed as weapons, and slogans like, "Stop hitting us." These uprisings were celebrated in the song right up until they were crushed by a well-fed army with metal hats. Survivors were given stern looks, followed by creative forms of discouragement. Occasionally, someone would become a folk hero simply by existing in defiance of the law. Outlaws lived in forests, which were technically illegal unless the king needed a place to hunt things. These rebels stole from the rich, gave to the poor, and were generally admired by everyone except the rich. Their stories were passed down through generations, usually with more accuracy than official records. Taxes continued to evolve, always in one direction, upward. During times of war, famine, or royal boredom, new taxes were invented with startling creativity. There was a beard tax, a window tax, and a tax for not attending church, which conveniently doubled as evidence of heresy. Refusal to pay led to audits conducted with torches and shouting. Tax collectors were viewed with a blend of fear and loathing, typically reserved for pests and apocalyptic horsemen. Their arrival in the village was heralded by silence, closed shutters, and the sudden disappearance of anything vaguely valuable. Collectors travelled with guards because even the nicest villages considered it a civic duty to trip them into puddles. Economic advice from nobles to peasants usually consisted of "try harder," "be grateful," or "have you considered inheriting land?" There was little understanding of poverty, largely because nobles believed food appeared on tables via divine magic, and servants just enjoyed working for free. Fiscal empathy was not a strong suit. Meanwhile, peasants developed their own rules, informal systems of fairness, barter, and quiet resistance. These included unwritten laws like, "Don't rat out your neighbour unless they steal your pig," and "always hide one turnip." Their justice system relied on reputation, common sense, and the shared understanding that survival was a group project. The absurdity of the legal system reached its peak when laws began contradicting each other outright. For instance, one edict required all able-bodied men to fight in the king's wars, while another prohibited leaving the village without permission. The logical result was a large number of men simultaneously conscripted and imprisoned. No one knew whether to salute them or bring them soup. By late evening, as the sun dipped behind hills that also owed taxes, the legal machinery of the kingdom slowed but never stopped. Decrees were still being written, taxes still collected, and someone somewhere was undoubtedly being punished for not bowing properly. Justice never slept. It just took long, wine-fueled naps between abuses, and so the system endured. Not because it was just or efficient, but because it was stable in the way only deeply unfair things can be. The rich remained rich, the poor remained poor, and the law remained an elegant justification for both. But change, like rats in the granary, was always just beneath the surface. The king's problems are not like your problems. Kings, like anyone else, had problems. Of course, their problems came with gold trimmings, silk lining, and a committee of professional problem deniers. Yet, problems they remained. The challenge was not in the scale of suffering, there was very little of that, but rather in how extravagantly inconvenient something could be while still being laughably solvable by the application of wealth, privilege, or public beheadings. The first problem most kings faced was boredom, with their needs met by an army of servants, entertainment staff, and a questionable jester named Geoffrey, who told jokes mostly about goats. There was still the lingering emptiness of having nothing meaningful to do. One could only rearrange the furniture of the state so many times before feeling a spiritual hollowness that even wine-soaked poetry couldn't fix. To combat this, kings invented crises. They would awaken with the fury of a man who had misplaced his ceremonial spoon and declare war on a neighbouring village because the wind had blown their prayer flags in the wrong direction. Or worse, they would commission a new royal anthem, something with trumpets, at least 15 verses, and the subtle implication that everyone else should be grateful simply to exist in the same era. Meanwhile, the peasants' problems remained refreshingly unvarnished. Food or no food, dry or soaked, alive or dead. It was a brutally simple algorithm. A peasant did not lie awake at night pondering the burden of legacy or the proper etiquette of declining yet another diplomatic fruit basket. They lay awake because a mouse was eating their only sock. A common royal dilemma was court intrigue. Not intrigue in the literary sense, but in the deeply unproductive form of backstabbing among people who wore tights. Courtiers spent their days whispering, bowing too deeply, and expressing fake concern about the stability of the kingdom while hiding behind large fans. Being a king often meant trying to figure out who was plotting against you, while also pretending not to notice that your brother had recently named his cat Future Monarch. Peasants, too, experienced intrigue, usually over a missing chicken or the mysterious case of whose goat had trampled whose cabbage patch. These dramas unfolded with fewer codpieces and more shouting. Justice was swift and consisted of 3 neighbours shouting their opinions until someone cried or offered turnip as compensation. There were no written records, only exaggerated retellings and passive-aggressive baking. Then there was the matter of royal health. Kings worried about gout, melancholy, and the occasional stabbing. Their physicians, men trained by watching older physicians not wash their hands, prescribed treatments like leech application, pigeon smoke, and spiritual chanting. A king might spend days recuperating from the emotional trauma of a mild chill, while being fed by hand and serenaded with harp music. Peasants, on the other hand, defined health as still able to stand upright. Illness was met with folk remedies such as chewing bark, being slapped with a fish, or whispering threats at the moon. If the peasant recovered, the healer was praised. If the peasant died, it was chalked up to fate, curses, or having angered the village goose. Marital issues also plagued kings. Political marriages made love a diplomatic afterthought. A king might wake up beside someone he barely knew, but was technically allied with through 3 treaties and a treaty-related cousin. He would then spend breakfast politely ignoring her while flirting with a lady-in-waiting, whose name he'd forgotten but whose neckline he respected. The peasant's version of marital strife was less about geopolitics and more about whose turn it was to fetch the water or why the pig was in the house again. Romantic tension often took the form of deeply repressed sighs and occasionally throwing a wooden spoon at the general direction of one's beloved. The burden of heirs was another royal affliction. Kings were expected to produce them, name them confusingly after ancient relatives, and keep them alive long enough to be politically useful. Children were evaluated like livestock. Does he have strong bones? Can he hold a sword without crying? Is his forehead regal enough? Entire councils would meet to discuss the significance of a royal burp. Peasants, in contrast, had children for reasons of labour, lineage, and occasionally romance, usually by accident. Children were seen as either small workers or small disasters, often simultaneously. Their value was directly proportional to how long they could be trusted not to fall into the well. Religious dilemmas also occupied the royal mind. Was the king pious enough to be blessed but not so pious as to be boring? Did he show sufficient humility while still being considered God's chosen? The balancing act required frequent church attendance, elaborate offerings, and being mildly threatened by clergy in elaborate hats. For peasants, religion was more about survival than spiritual nuance. The gods were asked for rain, fertility, and fewer plagues. Offerings involved bread, song, and sometimes livestock bribery. Most spiritual enlightenment came during moments of near death or when the cider was strong. Diplomatic issues were also ever present. Kings received visiting nobility who brought gifts, gossip, and the faint scent of treason. Hosting such guests meant parading around in uncomfortable robes, listening to long speeches in languages no one really understood, and pretending to care about foreign cheese. Diplomatic alliances were sealed with awkward handshakes and even more awkward marriages. Peasants dealt with diplomacy in the form of village squabbles and the occasional tax collector with too much eyeliner. Foreigners were rare, and when they appeared they were immediately offered soup, interrogated politely, and watched until they either sang a song or helped build a fence. There were also seasonal problems. A king might fret over whether the annual summer tournament should feature bear jousting again, despite last year's incident involving a noble's leg and a deeply confused bear. Autumn brought leaf-related poetry and the problem of squirrels infiltrating the royal granaries. For the peasant, seasonal changes meant life or death logistics. Winter was especially thrilling. Would the firewood last? Would the roof hold? Would the snow be deep enough to trap the taxman? Spring brought hope and also mud in all conceivable forms. Summer meant sweating profusely while pretending to enjoy festivals, and autumn was spent preparing to suffer again. Fashion was another source of royal concern. A king's appearance mattered greatly, especially when portraits were involved. Decisions had to be made. Feathered hat or taller feathered hat, purple robe or purpler robe, too much embroidery, and one risked appearing frivolous. Too little, and one looked tragically modest. Peasant fashion was defined by durability and how much potato residue could be hidden in the folds. If it didn't fall off and vaguely resembled clothing, it was fine. Fashion innovation consisted of sewing patches in amusing shapes or daring to wear a second sock. Art, too, troubled the king. Was the court composer writing sufficiently flattering music? Was the tapestry long enough to commemorate his third military victory, the one where he didn't trip? And why did the royal painter insist on including that mole? Surely it was a shadow. Surely. Art among peasants was mostly practical, carving spoons, decorating beehives, and creating statues of saints with alarming teeth. Occasionally, someone would paint something on a barn wall, which would then be interpreted as either divine or deeply troubling, depending on the number of limbs involved. One overlooked royal affliction was managing favours. Every noble wanted something: land, titles, the right to say they once danced with the Queen's cousin. The king had to weigh requests carefully while pretending to care. Grant too many, and the realm crumbled. Grant too few, and someone would write a very unflattering poem. Peasants also had to manage favours, though on a smaller scale. Lending a bucket came with strings attached. Borrowing a chicken was tantamount to blood oath, and heaven help the man who forgot to return a borrowed ladder. He would never hear the end of it, even at his funeral. Leisure presented yet another royal dilemma. How does one relax when relaxation is mandatory? The king was expected to hunt, but not sweat, to dance, but not too enthusiastically, to smile, but only in woodcuts. Relaxation became a performance of contentment. Eyes glazed, goblet in hand, thinking about taxes. The peasant's leisure was accidental and brief, a few minutes under a tree before the cow found them, a sip of cider before the barn roof collapsed. True relaxation occurred only in sleep, and even then, only if no one nearby was coughing, giving birth, or arguing with the moon. Lastly, legacy haunted the king. Would future generations remember him as Harold the Great or Harold the Flatulent? Would his name inspire statues or sighs? He might commission chroniclers to write histories that creatively omitted failures and emphasized moments when he looked especially heroic while holding a pear. The peasant did not worry about legacy, he worried about potatoes. If remembered at all, it was through oral history. Old Jeb, the one who outdrank the bishop, or Martha, the goat wrestler. Their legacy was etched in laughter, scars, and very determined children. And so, while kings gazed out of high towers pondering the heavy burden of being adored, peasants ducked under low beams wondering if the roof would make it through another storm. Both had problems, but only one group had the freedom to solve theirs with a long nap, a new law, and a banquet featuring 15 kinds of goose. Revolt. Don't be ridiculous. In the grand scheme of history, revolutions are like that one friend who shows up at your party uninvited, drinks all the punch, and leaves the place a wreck. The idea of peasant uprisings, while romanticised in the tales of poets and ill-informed historians, was typically a bit more of a nuisance than an actual game changer for the kings of the medieval era. Revolts were like minor inconveniences, annoying sure, but easily handled, often with the help of the local militia, a few strategically placed archers, and a lot of optimism. If they didn't manage to completely wipe out the rebels, they could always take credit for the failure as a necessary lesson. The first thing to know about revolts is that they never happened at convenient times. Most peasants, who were otherwise too busy trying to keep their livestock from wandering off, or fixing thatched roofs that had a tendency to collapse when it rained, didn't have the time or resources to organise anything more elaborate than a half-hearted protest about turnip prices. By the time they were considering an actual revolt, they had usually been up to their elbows in animal dung for so long that the idea of a full-blown rebellion just seemed a bit much. They'd probably prefer to just take a nap instead. The second thing to remember is that a peasant revolt was a little like a flash mob. Fun in theory, a disaster in practice. Most of the time, peasants didn't have a clear goal in mind. Were they upset about the taxes? Probably. Were they angry about the king's occasional desire to raise taxes so he could buy more gold-plated chairs? Absolutely. But it wasn't always clear exactly what the peasants were revolting for, other than a vague wish to stop being stepped on like so many potatoes in a patchwork field of bad decisions. And as for the king, well, his reaction to these pesky uprisings was always predictably confident. He had a team of advisors, generals and tacticians who were always prepared for a potential peasant uprising, even though they secretly hoped they'd never need to use any of the plans, because quite frankly, suppressing revolts was hard work. It involved unsavoury things like armies, executions, and drawing lines on maps, none of which were particularly fun unless you had a particularly bloodthirsty disposition. The king's approach to rebellion was simple: act quickly, decisively, and if necessary, brutally. The fact that he had never actually been in a real revolt didn't bother him. After all, he had experience with difficult situations like royal feasts, where guests couldn't stop arguing about the quality of the pheasant, and that was pretty close to a war zone in its own right. No, the king would simply issue a proclamation, preferably in large ornate script, declaring that the revolt had been thoroughly squashed, possibly even before it had started. He would then retreat to his throne room, make a few well-timed sighs of displeasure, and go on with his life, all while maintaining that delicate balance of authority and indifference. The peasants, however, had a much different experience. Their uprising typically began with a great deal of shouting, some angry waving of pitchforks, and most importantly, a desperate need for a leader. They didn't have a royal court to guide them, and honestly, the idea of organising one was more work than most peasants cared to do. As a result, their leaders tended to be either self-appointed or, more often than not, completely random individuals who found themselves swept up in the chaotic tide of peasant unrest. Imagine a small, confused man with no formal military training suddenly being thrust into the role of revolutionary general. It was a little like hiring a jester to handle international diplomacy. It rarely ended well. In these early stages, the revolt would typically consist of little more than a parade of agitated villagers running through the streets, waving whatever tools they had on hand, usually for lack of any other weaponry. Occasionally there might be a disgruntled farmer who had managed to smuggle a rusty sword from a distant relative, but the idea that these peasants were going to overthrow the king with their current level of armament was about as likely as winning a jousting tournament with a toothpick. They were, in all fairness, equipped to harass the local tax collector for a while, but when faced with actual royal forces, the situation would typically dissolve faster than a sugar cube in hot tea. Of course, some peasants, those with a flair for dramatics, would try to stage an actual rebellion. They'd gather in the town square, declare their intentions loudly, and probably insult the king's mother for good measure. But without the necessary training, equipment, or clear strategy, the peasants were no match for the king's forces, who had spent years training in the arts of crushing uprisings before breakfast. Now let's talk about the rebellion leaders for a moment. The peasants never lacked for charismatic individuals who believed in the power of the common man. These leaders often had lofty ideas of equality, freedom, and possibly running the whole kingdom themselves. The unfortunate reality, however, was that these leaders were generally unprepared for the logistical nightmare of running a revolution. They didn't have the connections or the resources needed to provide their followers with food, shelter, or importantly, any kind of coherent battle plan. Their speeches were moving, sure, but usually ended with phrases like, "Let's show the king who's boss," which, while inspiring, didn't really provide a practical course of action. And so the rebellion would usually fizzle out, often before it had fully begun. There would be minor skirmishes with the royal guards, some token protests, and maybe a brief confrontation where one unfortunate peasant accidentally stepped on a pile of manure. Eventually, the peasants would return to their fields, feeling just slightly more dissatisfied with life than they had been before the revolt. But life, as always, would go on. The peasants would return to their usual cycle of hard labour, while the king would return to his throne, likely discussing the recent rebellion over a glass of wine and a new tapestry. This cycle of failed revolts had become so common that it might as well have been a social event. The king would host a lavish banquet to celebrate the quelling of another insurrection, complete with exotic dishes and musicians hired to entertain the royal court with compositions that were too fancy for peasants to even understand. Meanwhile, the peasants would quietly stew, wondering if they'd ever be able to organise something more effective than a parade of poorly constructed signs. As for the royal response, it was almost always the same, a polite but firm declaration that the peasants had been dealt with, their demands thoroughly ignored, and life would now return to its natural, orderly state. Occasionally the king would offer a small token concession, like lowering the tax rate by a fraction of a percentage point. The peasants, of course, would notice absolutely none of this, but it was a gesture that made the king look benevolent in the eyes of those who still thought he cared. And really, that was all that mattered. In truth, these revolts were nothing more than brief, noisy interruptions in the steady, grinding machinery of medieval life. The peasants might shout and protest, but the king's grip on power was like that of a man holding a large iron door shut against a breeze. The breeze might blow harder at times, but the door would never open, not unless the king decided it was time to open it. And frankly, he was far too busy with the important matters of the day to pay attention to the murmurs of peasants who couldn't even agree on what time lunch should be served, let alone how to overthrow a kingdom. As the sun set on yet another thwarted rebellion, the peasants would trudge back to their hovels, their dreams of revolution fading like the distant hope of a good harvest. And in the castle, the king would sleep soundly, secure in the knowledge that his throne was safe, for now. And so the world continued as it had before, one side weighed down by the constant struggle for power, the other by the humdrum monotony of survival. The peasants would complain, the king would declare peace, and life, absurd, relentless, and oddly predictable, would carry on. The plague of inconvenience. A plague had come, or more accurately, it had arrived in the way that plagues always did, uninvited, inconvenient, and entirely unprepared to wait for a proper invitation. It didn't care if it had the right permits. It didn't care if the peasants were busy working, or if the king had important matters like affairs of state to attend to, which usually meant eating large, decorative meals while deciding whether or not he would wear the gold crown with the red velvet cushions or the one with the purple ribbons. No, the plague had arrived without notice, in the way that only pandemics can, and immediately began its usual work, knocking on doors, walking into fields, and very quickly finding out how little people really understood about hygiene, medicine, or anything remotely resembling clean living. Of course, for the peasants, this was nothing new. After all, they had lived through any number of unspeakable diseases, from the slightly annoying sore throat plague to the maybe it's the weather, maybe it's something else plague. But this one, the new plague, was something else. It spread quickly. It spread far, It spread in a way that made the peasants sit up and consider whether it was time to ask the local priest if maybe, just maybe, it wasn't a good idea to get some extra candles and do a little more praying. Now, the response of the royal court to this crisis was, predictably, less focused on pragmatic solutions and more rooted in grandiosity. A royal proclamation was issued immediately, well, as immediately as these things were ever issued, which was usually within a week or so, after someone had had the brilliant idea to write it down and then get it delivered on horseback. The proclamation, naturally, did not acknowledge any threat to the actual royal family. After all, the king had a very important job to do, being both divine and untouchable, a fact he was quick to remind everyone of. Instead, the proclamation declared that the plague was merely a temporary inconvenience that would be addressed with appropriate fervour and style. The king, never one to miss an opportunity for a grand gesture, decided that a plague-themed masquerade ball would be the best possible response to the situation. Surely if the peasants saw the king hosting an extravagant party with masks, music and dancing, they would immediately understand that this plague was just one of those things that happened, like bad weather or poorly prepared venison. It was, after all, a very metaphorical plague. Everyone knew the king was above such petty matters as disease. Why, the mere notion that the king might be in any sort of danger was laughable. In fact, he was probably safer than anyone else. What with the enormous stone walls of the castle and the general distance between him and any unfortunate peasant, not to mention the fact that he'd recently ordered a new set of gold-plated handkerchiefs, which were considered essential for handling such matters of contagion. And so, as peasants dropped in the streets, the king's royal advisers gathered, notably one particularly clever physician who had a reputation for not actually knowing anything about medicine. This physician, naturally, was the one most consulted during the outbreak. His diagnosis: low-born thoughts, he suggested. Peasants think too much. They worry about all the wrong things, like illness and poor harvests, when they should focus on something simple like, say, the king's new throne design. In his expert opinion, the solution was straightforward: wine. More wine. And not just any wine, mind you. A medicinal wine, rich with the very essence of cheer and unrelenting optimism. He elaborated, all while swishing his own glass with a knowing smile. This will rid the body of such negative feelings and restore balance to the humours. His advice was, as always, followed enthusiastically. After all, who could argue with the benefits of a good wine, especially when it was prescribed by someone who had never once attended a medical school or looked at a textbook? Meanwhile, in the villages, things were less optimistic. Peasants had no wine to spare, unless you counted the sour wine they used for cooking, which would have been better off thrown into a ditch. They had no grand palace to retreat to. They had only their huts, their mouldy bread, and the stubborn refusal to accept their fates. There was a certain kind of stoicism in the air, though it wasn't the inspiring, heroic sort. It was more like the sort of stoicism you see in someone who realises they've just been told to make soup out of the same mouldy bread they've been eating for the past week. Thatch, who had somehow been assigned the thankless role of village healer, decided that if mouldy bread had worked to cure the common cold, an unlikely theory, but one he'd been testing for years, then surely it could be effective for the plague. Armed with his endless optimism and a large jar of questionable herbal concoctions, He wandered from hut to hut, offering the sick his expert care. His bedside manner, much like the qualifications, was charmingly inadequate. "Don't worry," he'd say, "the mould on this bread is practically medicinal. Think of it as nature's way of improving your health." In this manner he nursed dozens of peasants, none of whom appeared to get any better, but certainly no worse either. His main philosophy was simple. If you survived the treatment, you were probably just lucky. If you didn't, well, at least you weren't suffering anymore. Not to be outdone, the royal physicians continued to offer their wisdom. They too had a solution. More wine, but in moderation this time. As far as they were concerned, the plague was less about bodily infection and more about spiritual distress. "People who have low-born thoughts," one of them asserted, "are the true cause of this illness. You see, peasants tend to believe in these little things, like sickness and death, but they fail to grasp the higher reality of divine rule. They need to realign their minds with proper royal thinking." This noble solution was shared with no small amount of smugness, and its application involved the finest wines from the royal cellar, an offering that undoubtedly did wonders for the physician's own health, if not for the actual plague victims. Meanwhile, the peasants, ever resourceful, took a different approach. They began to delve into superstition. If prayer had worked in the past, and really it was the only thing they had left, they would pray harder, louder, and with even more fervour. They sacrificed chickens to unknown gods, drew strange symbols on their doorways with ashes, and gathered in large groups to chant at frogs. Yes, frogs. The rationale behind this was of course a mystery, but in their defence the frogs weren't doing anything else, so why not? One particularly enthusiastic individual even painted the frog gods on a series of boards and paraded them through the village in what could only be described as a chaotic yet impressively organised procession. "The frogs will save us," he declared with absolute certainty, despite no one else in the village having the slightest clue what he meant. Back in the palace, the king had responded to the crisis in the most fitting manner possible. He ordered a plague-themed masquerade ball. Why not? If people were going to die, they should at least do it with some style. The invitation read, "Come join us for a ball where the theme is morbidity itself. Wear your finest masks and prepare for a night of dancing, music, and celebration. Because nothing says we care like dancing during a plague." To this end, 34 musicians were hastily gathered, mostly because they were the ones who had been closest to the throne room when the idea was announced. They played upbeat funeral marches, because naturally the king preferred his death-themed music to be as cheerful as possible. The guests arrived, masked and wearing their most festive attire, ready to enjoy an evening of revelry, as if the air wasn't thick with the faintest smell of impending doom. As the night wore on, the music became more upbeat, the dancing more frantic, and the wine more plentiful. The king and his court took turns pretending to enjoy themselves, while simultaneously the peasants' lives were slowly being eroded by sickness and superstition. The king, oblivious to the actual suffering beyond the castle walls, danced the night away, his face hidden behind an elaborate mask, probably the same mask he would wear when ignoring reality. Meanwhile, the peasants outside, lacking music, wine, or anything resembling festive cheer, were left to make do with their prayers, frogs, and mouldy bread. The plague, like all things in medieval times, was handled with the usual mix of denial, ignorance, and superficial efforts to maintain the status quo. The peasants died, the court partied, and the world continued its slow march toward the inevitable. It's impossible to ignore the glaring differences between the peasants and the kings. While peasants were dying in droves, struggling with mouldy bread and a dash of misguided optimism, the king and his court treated the situation like it was an overblown metaphor, hosting a plague-themed masquerade ball, as if a fancy costume could cure the disease. The peasants, relying on superstition, prayers, and yelling at frogs, had no luxury to ignore the crisis. The king had plenty of luxury to pretend it didn't exist. At the heart of the divide is power, or the lack thereof. Peasants faced problems that were tangible: disease, hunger, and a future of dirt and despair. Meanwhile, the king's primary concern was maintaining his image and avoiding anything that threatened his comfort. When faced with the reality of a public health crisis, the king's solution was to throw a ball and let musicians play upbeat funeral marches. For the peasants, every day was a battle for survival. For the king, it was all about making sure the royal robe wasn't too uncomfortable and managing metaphorical threats. The peasants were dealing with life or death issues, and their solutions were as grim as their circumstances: mouldy bread, desperate prayers, and occasionally yelling at frogs. The king, meanwhile, believed the plague was simply caused by low-born thoughts and recommended more wine as treatment. The royal court, safely tucked inside the palace walls, remained untouched by the suffering of the common folk, living in a world of metaphorical problems that were more about aesthetics than actual survival. Ultimately, the differences between peasants and kings come down to one thing: reality. The peasants had no choice but to face it, while the king had the privilege of pretending it didn't exist. The peasants' problems were real, immediate, and deadly, while the king's problems were abstract, manageable, and largely centered on how to throw a good party in the face of a plague. While the peasants fought to stay alive, the king simply danced around the crisis with his court, comfortably removed from the harsh realities below. The peasants' solutions, however misguided, came from desperation, while the king's came from the ridiculous luxury of not having to care.